This is a shortened version of what the difference is between litigation hold, legal hold, in-place hold, retention labels, retention policies. So let's jump in. Okay, so we talked about the different ways that you can retain information within 365. So there's a term that you've heard called legal hold or litigation hold. There's retention policies, retention labels. Like there's all this stuff to be able to retain information within Exchange and SharePoint. But the core differences are around how much of that data you're keeping. So litigation hold is like an old way of being able to retain information within Exchange Online, right? Litigation is a proprietary term that Microsoft gave to be able to say, as people join, we want to provide litigation hold to that mailbox or mailboxes for either a period of time or indefinitely. So this was a manual process that admins would do as people joined and left. But it meant that you were keeping everything, that whole entire mailbox, all of the items that sit inside it. So as time's gone on, we now use retention policies to either do the same thing, so keep all information, or we can create queries that says just keep this information that I'm looking for. And then we can place time periods on that. So we could do retention policies that says retain for 10 years and then automatically delete, or we can do in-place holds, as we call them, which is the same as retention policies as well, but we're using those in different terms, which is being able to do like an e-discovery hold or a legal hold, as some organizations call it. So for the lifetime of that e-discovery case, we're placing those mailboxes or those repositories or those custodians on hold. So we're making sure they don't delete anything. And the reason why it's called in-place hold is we don't copy data anywhere else. So that user's mailbox, if there's items inside there we need to retain, then we're keeping that in place, but in an area that user can't see or touch or make changes to. So the way that this works under the covers is we've all got a mailbox, right? We all know where our inbox is. And when our manager rings up and says, hey, did you read that email from me? And you go, let me just have a look. And you probably go into your deleted items folder and then retrieve it again and then read it very quickly. It's just a process of moving data around. So in our mailbox, for example, when we delete that email from our manager, it gets moved into our deleted items where we normally recover it. Or if it's something that we just don't need anymore, or maybe I'm doing something malicious and I say, well, I just want to hide that email, I might decide to delete it from my deleted items folder. And if you're a bit more tech savvy, what happens is it's moving that email or the content into the recoverable items folder. So you can still go into this recoverable items folder as an end user, and then you can decide either to purge it from there, or you can recover those items from that deletions folder as well. You'll also notice some other subfolders in here, which we'll go into in a minute, but these folders underneath, the end user can't actually see. But remember, this is all in place, is all in the mailbox that person is using. So if I want to go into my deleted items and then purge that email I'm trying to hide from there, I can, and it gets moved into the purges folder. So there's a cleanup process, a mailbox management process that runs every couple of hours or every couple of days, depending on how busy it is. And then it'll actually go through and then permanently delete that content. So this is quite a common thing when we're talking to our customers, especially around having like a third-party backup. Do I need to back up all of my data on 365? Well, no, not necessarily. Default, right, is any items that are in this recoverable items is purged after a default of 14 days. Now, excuse my writing with a mouse, but after 14 days, it's gone forever, right? We can change this in the Exchange admin settings to 30 days. Then after 30 days, again, it's deleted forever. So the difference is if we're using retention policies or retention labels that have an associated policy, or we're using things like litigation hold in Exchange, or we're using legal hold or hold in e-discovery, then what happens with those items, instead of going into the purges folder here, it gets moved into this discovery hold folder. And then if we've got a policy that says policy, by the way, if I can type and talk, we've got a policy in there that says retain information for 10 years. Then it's kept in that folder, in place, in the mailbox for 10 years. And then that policy might be automatically delete those items after 10 years, right? Or if it's an e-discovery hold that we do in the e-discovery tool, then you can say, right, put that mailbox on a hold, and it's held then for the lifetime of that case. So when that e-discovery case is closed, then the normal life cycle will carry on with this mailbox. So if there's a retention policy or retention label on certain items, they may have been due to purge, but there's a set of principles that say keep information for longer depending on the retention policy that you get. And these set of principles is basically this. So the longest retention wins over deletion, which means that if you've got an item that says keep for 10 years, and then you've got an e-discovery in place hold that says, right, keep indefinitely until I say so, especially around kind of financial institutes where they have a destruction of hold order from the regulators that says this type of information you must not delete until we say, then that's what they do. They go inside e-discovery, they place those repositories or those mailboxes in a hold, and the longest retention wins overall, right? And then once that's taken off, then whatever the least retention period, obviously that wins. So it says, right, keep for 10 years and then automatically delete. But this is where you need to understand how these principles work, because especially in the GDPR world where there's the right to erasure, if someone says, hey, go away and delete my data, and you have an overarching retention policy somewhere that's keeping the data, the retention is always going to win. So you need to find out which retention policies that data is associated with, and then have an appropriate retention policy that is also like a deletion policy. I don't know why we call it retention policies, because you can delete it there. So you can say any items that are like older than a year, then delete, rather than saying keep this data for 10 years and then delete. So it's the reverse of that, but they're still called retention policies rather than deletion policies, right? And that, like I said, the default retention for exchange data is 14 days unless there's a policy to say keep that information for longer. So what you can see on the screen here is just the process of that. So we're in that user's mailbox. We are in, let's get a pen up here. We're in the recoverable items folder. And then we know default process is delete that data after 14 days. Permanent deletion, can't get it back. However, if we're retaining that information, so we've got this retention period up here, and this could be our 10 years, right? That after the 10 years, then it carries on that process to automatically delete it. But if we want to get that data back, then we can use e-discovery in order to interrogate that user's mailbox or that SharePoint site, and then retrieve those items either from the recoverable items folder or the preservation hold library in Exchange. In SharePoint. Get my terms right. Similarly with SharePoint, let's go into that, is this red box that's on the outside here. Remember, there's only two repositories in 365 that we hold customer data, which is Exchange and SharePoint predominantly. Yes, there's some caveats with that, especially if you're looking at like Stream at the moment. Stream version 1 was keeping recordings in Azure Blob storage. That's now changing. So those recordings are going to be kept within SharePoint or OneDrive for Business. And if you didn't know already, OneDrive for Business is just a SharePoint site. It's just assigned to an individual user. So we talked about, this demarcation here, this whole site, and that contains things like the document libraries. That's what we're going to store our content to. It also contains all the versions. So versioning is turned on by default. So all major versions, I just put an M there, and then up to 500 revisions. So these can be customized. You can have less or more revisions, but you can also do minor versions as well. So those are delta changes that when a user opens up that Word document, they make a change to a paragraph or whatever, we're keeping the delta changes, the versions of those files. So you've got one file under the covers, but we can always recover or go and view a previous version to that. And that's really interesting when we get to records management and regulatory compliance as well. So those major versions are a mutable copy of the item, an unchanged copy of that item for the lifetime of the retention that's set for those records. And we'll go into that again in a little bit, because there's different use cases, and there's a matrix to show you what you can and can't do between items that have a retention label or a policy versus a record versus a retention, a regulatory label to it as well. So I'll show you that in a second. Anyway, so remember, SharePoint is just a site with some files in it, these lines of files, and then we can have multiple people, which are these circles, accessing that data. Whereas the OneDrive site is also a site, but it's down to you as an individual, right? It's assigned to you. You might keep your working files in there that are personal to you, but we can also share, like we can in SharePoint, right? We can share these out to people inside our organization or inside our organization, right? Or around collaborative working. But default retention for SharePoint, if we're moving or deleting items even, we're deleting items, but they're getting moved into a recycle bin. And in SharePoint, there are two recycle bins. These are bins, by the way. I cannot draw with a mouse. And this is the first recycle bin and the second recycle bin. And as a user deletes a file, this is normal behavior, it gets moved into the first recycle bin. So there's our item in there. And the end user can go into that recycle bin and recover that item if they need to, right? The self-recovery, you can do that. But after a period of time, it gets moved into the secondary recycle bin. So that's where SharePoint admin can go in and also recover those items if they need to. But there's a period of time between these two recycle bins. All right, so there's going to be 93 days before that individual item that's sat in their second recycle bin now that gets permanently deleted. It's gone forever. Can't recover from that. Unless there's a retention policy, a retention label assigned to that individual item, or there's an e-discovery hold, or legal hold on those items. And then what happens there is, depending on whether it's one of those use cases, if it's a retention policy assigned to this document library, for example, and an end user tries to delete it, it gets a copy is moved into the preservation hold library. So that's a document there. But we also have the item that's moved into the recycle bin as well. So the end user can recover that if they need to. But because we're retaining that information, it gets moved into the preservation hold library. Now, this is slightly different to Exchange. Those hidden folders that I talked about, an Exchange admin can't go into them and view the items. They can see how big they are using PowerShell, how much information is in there, but they can't go in and recover those items unless they use eDiscovery to export that item and then put it back into the user's mailbox. In SharePoint, the preservation hold library, a SharePoint admin can look inside here and then say, oh, look, these are all the items that are being held. They cannot delete from here, but they can recover from the preservation hold library. And remember, this preservation hold library is part of the overall site. So if you're trying to delete a site or archive a site, then if there's items being held in here, it won't let you delete that site at all. It's encapsulated in this. So especially when we talk about Microsoft Teams and we archive teams from there, after a period of time, those teams or the underlying 365 group that gets created as part of it gets deleted. But if there's items being held in the SharePoint site that was part of the team, then we retain the site. So we can get the data out from it. Just after a period of time, we can't recover that team site. You have to create a new one then. And again, there's guidance on how long we keep those archived teams and then what we do with the data under the covers, especially around chat, right? For Microsoft Teams, chat is stored within Exchange. Again, if we're retaining that information, and Teams chat information, by the way, can only be kept as part of a retention policy. So you can't apply labels to content within there. Is we're keeping that mailbox, that 365 group mailbox, for the period of time that the retention policy is set to. So when we talk about deleting of data or saving data or backups of data within 365, it's the retention policies and the legal holds that are all keeping that data in place. So we don't copy it to another place. We don't use like another archive somewhere to go and find that data. It's literally all kept in place, either within the mailbox or within the SharePoint site. Even if those end users decide to leave the organization, So we go back to our mailbox here, right? And me, this is me, very thin me, I should say. I decide to leave the organization, so my user account gets deleted. And I did have, this is supposed to be a scroll with my license on, is I did have a license assigned to me. And as part of my license, maybe I've got E3 or E5, that allows me to have that hold or retention on that mailbox. So they need to be set first before I get deleted. And when my user account actually gets deleted, this mailbox is orphaned. So if there's no retention policies or any hold, by default, this mailbox is deleted after 30 days. Again, it's gone forever. I can reassign it to a manager or another user if need be. So you can do that with these inactive mailboxes, as they're called. But if this mailbox or items inside there are being kept for a period of time, we keep the mailbox. This inactive mailbox then is searchable through eDiscovery, so you can still retrieve items from it. But as the items kind of go through that life cycle, and it says delete after 10 years, and there's nothing being retained inside that mailbox anymore, then that mailbox will eventually be deleted automatically as well. So there's no licensing costs for these inactive mailboxes. You can actually create retention policies that are dedicated to inactive mailboxes as well. So that's a really nice way, especially if you need to keep information for longer or shorter, then those dedicated policies will help you do that. And just to kind of finish this off, I have another slide here that talks through the retention policies in SharePoint. So basically what I just talked about, right, is default behavior is this Word document goes up to the first stage recycle bin, it gets purged into the second, and then after that it's deleted forever after 93 days as it goes through that process. If the item needs to be kept, then a copy gets moved into the preservation hold library. It's kept for, say, 10 years, whatever the policy is set to. And then after those 10 years, then there's a cleanup process as well, much like Exchange does. And it can take up to 7 days for that deletion policy to happen. So even though it might be set to 10 years, it might be 10 years and 7 days for that to be permanently deleted. Another sort of advanced feature that I talk about is around having a report of those deleted items. So if you've got a retention policy that says delete after 10 years, automatically it's gone. You don't know like where it's gone. You don't get a report from it. But if you've got a disposition review set up, so somebody reviews that item and says, oh, yeah, it does need to be deleted or kept for longer, or the policy needs to be changed, then when they hit delete, they will get a, I think it's a CSV report that they can download, and then they get a full report of all the items that were defensibly deleted. So that's the difference between automatic deletion and disposition. So you're reviewing what's being deleted, you as the human being makes a decision that it does need to go, and then you can get a report about what was deleted. And that's super important, especially around highly regulated organizations or local governments. You know, they need to prove that these items have been deleted. So disposition review is what that is for. And I did say that I promised I'd show you this matrix as well. And the way that we're reading this is we've got retention labels up here. And retention labels can be a label or a tag, as I call them, because you're not writing metadata to the content. But a retention label can also have an assigned retention policy to it. So when that label gets applied to the content, there's a policy that says keep for 10 years. Or you can just tag it, and it's just a way of discovering or understanding what that data contains. And then we also have record labels. So depending on whether those items are locked or unlocked, depends on what you can do and what use case down the bottom here. Or what's hidden away, you have to turn on by PowerShell, is regulatory records. And you can see the actions here are all blocked, but you can copy or move within a container, but you can't make any changes. So if you want to make items immutable, as you cannot make any changes to that document, then a regulatory record is the way to go. These other ones that we talked about, these retention labels and record labels, note here that an end user can change those labels. And this is probably the number one concern that I speak about to my customers is if you've got automatic labeling happening, that's great. But if your end users can see published labels, they can also make changes or even take the label off. So regulatory records are probably the way to go if that's a concern for your organization. And then we've got another one over here, which again is all hidden away in PowerShell, but this is called preservation lock. So what that does is similar to a regulatory record, is you can't make any changes to the policy at all. The only thing you can do is change the retention period up. So you keep things for longer. You can't keep them for less. The items that have that preservation lock or that regulatory record, again, they're immutable, can't make any changes for the lifetime of the retention period that you've set. And also you can't ring Microsoft and say, hey, can you take that preservation lock off for me, please? Because it's a regulatory standard. So if you're a US organization and you need to meet rules or regulations like SEC 17A-4, then you'll be very used to talking about worm storage. So that's where we can keep items in software and make sure that they're retained for the period of time that you need to meet regulatory compliance for as well. So there's a couple of different ways of doing that. This matrix is on Microsoft Docs as well, and there's a link at the very bottom here that really gives you an idea about how we're keeping data in 365, what different retention models there are. Under the covers, the technology is exactly the same, by the way. We're just keeping in place in those folders I talked about, but we can do things like litigation hold in Exchange. We can do retention policies in 365, which is cover Exchange and SharePoint and OneDrive and Teams and all of those. We can do these records, and we can do regulatory records as well if we need to make items immutable. Thank you very much.